My name is Kent, but that really isn't important. I am writing this in hopes that someone reads it and can empathize with what I am going through. That being said, here is what happened. My brother Cameron and I always liked hiking, hunting, camping, and so on. We not only spent countless hours in the woods, but also began teaching a wilderness survival class at the local high school, where people in the community and kids come after hours to learn the basics of how not to die in the woods. I am telling you this to give you perspective on just how odd this story is. But words will never do my brother justice. Not quite 2 years ago, Cameron and I were planning a 4-day hunting trip up north, near the Great Lakes. We lived in Tennessee, so we would be far from home. We spent the week leading up to the trip meticulously choosing our equipment and telling our friends and family exactly where we would be and when we would be checking in. We were well aware the first step to being rescued in an emergency is to let someone know they had to come looking for you in the first place. We had our bags packed to sustain us in a comfortable way for the 4-day trip, with enough extra food that we could last about a week off of our packs alone. We both planned on bringing rifles, of course, and Cameron always carried a 10mm Glock when he went to the wilderness. Our family expressed no apprehension when we finally headed north. We had made trips like this a dozen times. After a lengthy car ride, we had arrived. We parked our truck and headed into the woods. It was fall, and the temperature would be dropping fast before the sun even fully set. This gave us just a few hours to make it deep into a land untouched by other humans. It's odd how the forest seemed to swallow us that day. It wasn't spooky at first, but the landscape felt more like an ocean than a forest, on account of how it had no visible end. The terrain was in pristine condition, tampered with only by nature. We marched deep into the forest, and as darkness fell, I was left with a sense of unease. This wasn't uncommon for me, however. Cameron was the one with the iron will. I loved the outdoors, but without my brother, I would not have had the nerve for an overnight trip like this. We were forced to make camp, since light was becoming more and more scarce. We pitched our tents and used small camp stoves to heat up our food. A fire might disturb the wildlife, and we wanted to leave as little a footprint as possible. Dusk faded, and in its place was an ominous darkness. Moments like this are when I'm most on edge. I always felt like there was something out there, hiding in the shadows, just waiting for me to enter my tent. In all my time out there in the woods, I never saw anything with my eyes, but there are just so many places for something dark to hide in this land of shadows. My brother decided to turn in for the evening, and became situated in his tent. I did the same, sharing with him a single head nod before he zipped the tent. That was the last time anyone saw Cameron. I fell asleep pretty quick and didn't wake until the next morning. I was chilled right down to the bone, a deep coldness that only hours in a tent can give one. I desperately needed some coffee. I opened my tent flap, the cold zipper not being one to cooperate. Upon stepping out, I immediately noticed Cameron's tent was left open. I called for my brother, but got only silence in return. Pulling the flap back, I noticed his tent was vacant. His pack was still present, but he definitely had his boots, and I didn't see his rifle or sidearm in his tent. I figured he might have awoken before me, and decided to have a walk. I suppose it wouldn't be that strange. I resigned to making coffee and waiting for him to return. I felt uneasy about him being gone, but when nearly 45 minutes had passed and he still wasn't back, I was on the brink of panic. Cameron knew better than to walk off without telling me. It went against basic survival principles. I checked his equipment more thoroughly to see if he took his sat phone, and sure enough, it was gone. A small wave of relief washed over me when I realized I would be able to call him. I raced over to my tent, pulling on my shoes and jacket as I dug my own sat phone out. I called him, and I had never prayed so hard just to hear my brother's voice. It never came, though. Over and over I called, but was met with only silence, not just from the phone, but all around me. Fortunately, the sat phones were able to track one another, so I pulled up the location on my device, kind of like that Find My iPhone app. My heart sank as I looked at the screen to see where Cameron's phone was located. It was 12 miles away. Even if he had left as soon as I had entered my tent, he couldn't have made it that far. A mile in the woods is much more difficult to cover than a mile on a road, for example. In the wilderness, you have to go around obstacles, and up and down hills, and through foliage. There's just no way Cameron had moved 12 miles. I did the only thing I knew to do, and phoned the authorities. The panic in my voice was obvious, as I explained the situation. They told me to remain where I was, which is what one does to avoid becoming lost as well. They said they wouldn't be able to reach me until almost dark, but I did what they asked of me, and stayed put. The idea that Cameron needed help, and I was just sitting here, wrenched at me, but I figured it best. That was what I told myself in the moment anyways. The truth was less honorable. Even as early as that moment, I was certain something had taken Cameron, and I was terrified it would get me as well. Hours passed, and slowly, life came back to the forest. I was able to hear birds and chirping after a few hours, and every now and then I even heard an animal stomping around. To some this would be comforting, but every little noise sent cold chills down my spine. After a few more hours, the search team showed up, just as darkness was falling. I re-explained what happened to the team captain, and we checked Cameron's location on the sat phone again. He hadn't moved. They said they were calling in the National Guard, and in the morning they would have helicopters on Cameron's location to rescue him. In the meantime, they drilled me with questions, and it became obvious they suspected foul play was involved on my end. One of the search coordinators stated 12 miles through the terrain Cameron would have had to cross would have been equivalent to almost 30 miles, and it was just impossible for my story to be legitimate. I broke into tears as I promised it to be the truth, and told them my friends and family could verify the time frame. But I think it all fell on deaf ears, at least for the time being. The next morning, the National Guard tracked down Cameron's sat phone. They found it, as well as his rifle, at the mouth of an uncharted cave. A cave rescue team was contacted and flown out in just a few hours. Everything happened so fast. As they were briefed on the situation and began their descent into the cave, it seemed like almost no time had passed at all. It was wide enough that they were able to crawl most of the way without trouble. Water trickled down the floor and ran into an endless number of small shoot-offs and cracks, none of which big enough for a person. The cave sloped down as it twisted its way into the earth. At about 115 meters in, they found something. My brother's boots. They took pictures and recorded everything with their helmet cams. The scene was a strange one, appearing as if Cameron had taken them off and set them on a small rock ledge just before the cave dives into a ravine straight down into blackness. The laces were even neatly folded. There was no chance the boots were kicked off in a panic while he was fighting for his life. All the evidence points to my brother just calmly taking off his shoes and jumping into this dark abyss. The rescue team said there was no way to make it down the ravine without the required equipment and years of experience. They tried to drop a line down the chasm, but at 400 feet of rope, they still hadn't found the bottom. Upon seeing this, the cave was dubbed a natural wonder and extremely dangerous. They retreated and called off the rescue. Experts would say it's just not possible for him to be alive if he was down there. The cave was examined by wildlife experts, and it was decided that not only are there no known creatures that would have lived in the Great Chasm, but there are no signs of animal life anywhere near the cave. No birds, no deer, not even an insect was found there. It was so odd, in fact, that some members of the rescue team were anxious just to get out of there. That cave, which no one had ever found, or found and lived to tell someone else at least, was dubbed a danger to the public, and its exact location was redacted. My brother's case was closed, and it stirred much controversy. The police ruled that he had gotten lost and his remains were never recovered. Even the rescuers say that's ridiculous, because the dog teams all track his scent back to the cave's mouth, which is as far as the dogs would go before digging their heels into the ground. No one can explain how he covered the distance either. I was ruled out as a suspect because, as impossible as it was for either of us to hike to the cave in the allotted time, it was even more impossible for me to have made it there and hiked back in time to meet the rescuers. I know something happened to my brother. I don't know what, but something took my brother in the forest.